everyone. My name is Pamela Gupta, and I'm a professor of anthropology based at Weiser at the University of Witwatersrand here in South Africa. So I want to welcome you all to this third panel on transformative breath. And we have three very exciting speakers that I'm just going to introduce before I allow each speaker to give their 20-minute presentation. So we first have Ana Laura Funes, who's based in the philosophy department at Eastern Connecticut State University. And she will be followed by Arthur Rose, who's a Vice Chancellor's Fellow in English at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And then last but not least, Giuseppe Capalbo, who's a PhD student in literature and English at the University of Verona, Italy. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Anna, and I believe Charlotte's going to do a bit of the timekeeping. So we're going to have three presentations, 20 minutes each, and then we'll have hopefully a half an hour for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Charlotte, for the organization of this panel and this conference. I'm really excited, nervous, happy to be sharing with you a little bit of my work. So I recorded my whole presentation, but I am going to try to guide us through the slides without reading too much, because that's what I did in the recording. Yeah, so I'm a Mexican philosopher that teaches at US, and I have been doing a lot of research on the notion of prana in Indian philosophies. Particularly, this project explores the relational aspects of breath, both in Vedanta and Sāṃkhya traditions. And what I'm trying to do with this project is to construct or think an intercultural ethics of breath, also inspired by the work of Luce Irigaray, who's a French philosopher, and she has also been working a lot with this notion of cultivating the breath as a way of creating community, as a way of recognizing the other. And this notion of the other and relationality of the breath is not necessarily found in early sources in Indian philosophy, but there is a particular text in the Sāṃkhya tradition called the Yuktidīpikā, which is very interesting because it is there where I have been able to find in a more elaborated way this relational aspect of prana, which is literally translated as vital breath or vital force. So I start my reflection with, this common experience that breath or breathing is usually thought of as an individual act. It is oneself who breathes. It is a function that happens in the individual organism. But recently, and with the experience that we are all undergoing today with the COVID pandemic, more people have started to realize this relational aspect of breath, how much we breathe with others and how much our breathing affects others. So this relationality of the breath and this idea that the breath is always relational has been worked by Luce Irigaray in her work, The Way of Breath, where she reminds us that the breath is always and has always been an original co-breathing. We have always shared our breath, and the remembering that we have shared the breath at the moment, the beginning of all human life in the womb, is for her a way of recognizing, first of all, that there is a sexuated aspect to our breathing, in the sense that there is always a maternal feminine element in the beginning of our breathing. And so to reflect that on that experience, which is actually a non-linguistic, non-discursive experience, is a way of bringing us back to a tangible, even though invisible, relation that connect the subject to their breathing with otherness, not necessarily appealing to a subject-object division. Breathing is this aspect of our beings, and specifically if we bring that idea to the experience in the womb, that blurs the boundaries between self and other, fetus and mother, internal and external, otherness and selfhood. So in this sense, for Luce Irigaray, breathing could be considered as a mode of thinking, as a mode of relating to otherness in ways that are not necessarily appropriating the other, not reducing the other to our rational linguistic categories. So I try to explore this notion and how it, and whether it is in some way present in Indian philosophies, and if it is, how does it appear itself in the Indian tradition. And when we look at the Rig Veda, a very ancient text, there is a hymn called the Hymn of Creation, or the Nasadiya Sukta, and I quote, "In the beginning, there was no death nor immortality, no sign of day or night. That one breathed without air by its own power. There existed nothing else beyond that. Darkness existed, hidden by darkness in the beginning. Indistinguishable, all this was water." And Luce Irigaray also finds this quote, and together with Luce Irigaray, I read this passage as a way of noticing how there is this distinction between the one and the otherness that surrounds it, which Irigaray is reading that as the mothers that surround it. So there is, in a way, an initial relationality that recognizes a breath that is at the same time one and at the same time dual. So this dual one breathing as the source of an authentic subjectivity of the we, as a ground of differentiation between an I and a you, and not just as something that happens in one I and another I and another I. So this realization that breathing is always a co-breathing has the possibility of engendering an understanding of the self that could breathe, that could think with the surrounding world, with others, rather than against them or always separate from them. So, so I want to see how this sharing of breath appears in the Indian philosophy, and I start by bringing the reflections back to the Upanishads, where we see clearly the sharing of breath in the relationality between the teacher and the disciple. You know, the transmission of knowledge is very important in this tradition. So the discussion of prana appears in how important it is to know the prana, to know the vital breath. And so, of course, one could only obtain this knowledge from a qualified teacher, who is someone who has mastered their own breath. And mastering one's own breath consisted in becoming aware of one's own vital breath as one with the cosmic breath, or Brahman. So we see in the Upanishads that prana is initially considered as something that is shared by all men, women, beyond differences of age, culture, gender, class, race, etc. However, when I, taking into consideration the reflection that Luce Irigaray invites us, she reminds us that in the sharing of breath, in the authentic sharing of breath, there needs to be a respect of the natural and spiritual life of the self and the other. So there is an acknowledgement that the sharing of breath requires at the same time the articulation of singularity of the difference, and particularly of sexuate difference. So it's interesting for me to see that in Upanishads, we see a type of breath that seeks to merge the individual prana with the cosmic prana. Yet, following Luce Irigaray's call for the sharing of breath would require another type of relationality that would seek to build bonds between different subjects. So this happens in the Indian tradition, particularly in the yogic tradition, where there is the realization of the differences of breath. You know, there are different types of rhythm, there are different breaths. Some people breathe longer, some people breathe slower. There is this recognition of the differences in breath. However, philosophically speaking, we can still ask the question about how to harmonize between these two poles of breathing experiences. On the one hand, you have the original co-breathing that Luce Irigaray is talking about, and on the other hand, we the recognition that there is an autonomous type of breathing at the same time. So how can there be a recognition of the equal importance of the multiplicity of breaths without also vanishing them into a oneness, an undifferentiated oneness that blurs all those differences? So I find this story in the Upanishads very interesting, where Prajapati, who is the creator god, stands alone. He feels no happiness, and he's meditating on himself so that he can create numerous offspring. But when he creates them, they are there lying like a stone, lifeless. So then he thinks within himself, okay, let me enter within in order to awaken them. And when he does that, he becomes like the wind. He makes himself like wind and tries entering into its offspring as a one, but he couldn't. So that's where he divides himself into 5 different winds, which is the famous theory of the fivefold wind in Indian philosophy, which is the prana, apana, samana, udana, and vyana. And each of them has a different function attributed to them that in the yogic tradition is related to particular functions in the bodily experience, in the physiological experience too. So for example, we see prana related to the functions of expelling substances from the body, from the navel down to the ground, and also the motion that goes down, so it is related also with the function of inhaling. We see prana related to the function of going forward, so from the inside out and exhalation, and is also related to sensations that have to do with assimilating things, so from the mouth, from using our eyes, ears, etc. And it's also related to the functions of the lungs and the heart. Then we have samana, which I'll focus on it in a moment, but it is related with digestion, digestive functions. Vyana, which is related to the circulatory system, and udana, which is related to the cognitive functions. But then later in the Vedanta tradition, with a philosopher of the 8th century, Shankara, we see this correlation between the individual breaths and the environmental aspects of the breath. For example, we see the relation of apana with the functions, the global functions of gravity, grounding. We see the relation of samana with the space between earth and sun, or udana being related to the motion of going up, like the fire flames, and vyana, we see it in relation to all the circulatory forces in the globe, such as the wind, the ocean currents, etc. Now, in the yogic tradition, all of these winds were cultivated through, specific ways of moving the winds in one way or another through the techniques of pranayama. And a lot of modern interpretations of the Indian theory of bodily winds focused on its development in the yoga tradition, which teaches this harnessing of the individual breath flows through the yogic bodies in ways that create longevity, health, and in some texts they also talk about immortality. So various scholars have read this theory of the bodily winds as an early description of human physiology. But what I propose is, some people relate the theory of prana to early theories of respiration, or early theories of the circulatory system, even to early theories of the nervous system. And it's very interesting to make this correlation. However, I am suggesting that we should not just read the function of the pranas as a proto-physiology, because this tends to ignore its philosophical aspect, and particularly the dual aspect of breath, which is on the one hand natural. There is an individual physical and physiological aspect of breath, which is interconnected with the external air, the atmosphere, the environment. And this is autonomous, dynamic movement, unconscious most of the time. But there is this other very important aspect of prana, of breath, which is the spiritual aspect that Luce Irigaray calls it that way, which is connected with other individual breaths. It's the constant act of creating meaning. And this breath, if left unconscious, runs the risk of merging itself into a logic of oneness that doesn't recognize difference, neither the sexuate origin of our initial co-breathing. So it is this particular aspect that interests me in the development of an intercultural ethics of breath, and which I am was very excited when I found that in the Yuktidīpikā, which is an 8th century commentary on the Sāṃkhya Karika of Ishvara Krishna, which is a classical text from the Sāṃkhya tradition, we see in chapter 29 a whole elaboration on the theory of prana and the 5 winds, related to social aspects, interpersonal aspects. And here, prana is not only understood in terms of vital breath, but it's also understood as this inclination. And this notion of inclination is understood both as a physical action, but it's also understood as a psychological, intentional action. And so in the Yuktidīpikā, I don't have a slide for this, but you know, the relations that we saw between the 5 pranas and certain physiological functions in the individual, the Yuktidīpikā relates them to ways in which we interact with others. So for example, prana is related to the state of being inclined, and the Yuktidīpikā gives the example of an inclined tree, but it also gives the example of an army ready to win the battle, you know, or someone who is dispositioned towards virtue or towards pleasure, or the yearning to learn. So this going forward. Apana, for example, is associated with the attitude of departure or avoidance, particularly avoiding knowledge or avoiding virtue. Udana, which is the wind that moves upwards, is associated with feelings of status, social superiority, self-judgment, the desires to win, to excel. Viana, which is related to, you know, the wind that circulates all around, is here related to a very culturally associated example with the ritual of sati, which is the ritual where the wife sacrifices herself in the fire pit when the husband dies. But this particular example is used to convey the idea of inconditionality in the breath of Viana. And lastly, which is the one that interests me the most, is Samana, which is related to all of these interactions with others, with gatherings, with your family, with friends, with people, especially when you share food, where you are sharing drink, you know, where the functions of the digestive system are involved. And so we can see in the way the Yuktidīpikā talks about the prana, that the movement of this dynamic force involves not only a physical movement, a dispositional movement, it's both internal and external, and it is acknowledging our interrelationality. And so this particular breath is very interesting because there are examples that connect it not only in relation with other human beings, but also talks about the samana that appears in dogs, in salivating dogs, right? Presumably when there is this interaction between a human and a dog, or between animals themselves. It was the example of mating, etc. So this particular way of understanding prana refers to the relationality, the recognition of difference, and not necessarily only between humans. So I'm just going to summarize all of this with this slide. I trace the notion of prana and the relational aspects of prana back to the Upanishads, where we see this relationality between the teacher and the students, and the emphasis on the union between the personal breath and the cosmic breath to experience liberation. And then we see a more elaborated aspect of prana in the yogic tradition, where the 5 winds are related to physiological aspects of our organism, and that breath needs to be cultivated in ways that we can create a strong, healthy, and divine body. And then I arrived to Sāṃkhyan philosophy, where we see in the Yuktidīpikā the cultivation of a self-affective breathing that can be shared in connection with others under the recognition of a multiplicity of breaths, which is what I recovered from reading this tradition together with Luce Irigaray, the need to recognize this breath in women, in Black and Indigenous communities, in the breath in the minorities, children, older people, people with different abilities, in animals, in the environment. So what I'm trying to do is think an ontology of breath from the oneness to the two-ness, so that I can begin or we can begin to think about prana as a shared breathing act, and this I see it in the notion of samana. So I'm hoping that this type of reflection can help construct a global intercultural ethics of breathing. So thank you for listening, and this is it.
Thank you, Anna. We're going to move on to Arthur now.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for your time. I'm acutely aware that some of you will have heard this presentation before, and some of you perhaps not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first, say, page and a half of the presentation, and then just sort of take a step back and try to talk through what it is that this presentation is trying to do. It comes out of some work that I did for the Life of Breath project, based between Durham and Bristol universities. And it's really, I guess, this it's part of a broader project that's about thinking about breath in post-colonial literature, the function it plays, or the role it plays, and the function that it has. But in this particular iteration, I was kind of interested in the way in which you've got this profusion of breath metaphors in post-apartheid literature in and around the transition, so what we could call the early post-apartheid, and there's a sort of coincidence between this and what Pumla Dineo Gikuola would call rainbowism, and in a sense, what I'm interested in is whether there's anything of rainbowism now that it has been quite convincingly kind of condemned or recanted, whether there's anything in that ephemerality that might be redeemed or taken as a resource, albeit an ambivalent one. So yeah, so what I'll do, as I said, is kind of start by talking a little bit about, is sort of talking to the presentation that I gave, the first 2 pages, and then move to what I think the implications might be. In the end begins Ahmed Dangour's Kafkas Curse of 1997. Anna left her husband Oscar because he breathed down her neck. This opening startles us, I think, not just because it begins at the end, as it were, but because it relies upon a stark contrast between the seeming bathos of cause, Oscar's breathing down Anna's neck, and the profound rupture of effect, Anna's decision to leave her husband. Like the last straw that breaks the camel's back, it describes a routine minor action that culminates in disproportionate consequences. Now, in the time of COVID-19, breathing down somebody's neck is perhaps a little more threatening than it was then. But one of the few experiences we might think of as having genuinely affected us all together, and here I want to recognize how disproportionately COVID-19 has affected many of us, is the sense of traumatic intensity associated with the monitoring of our own breath and each other's. Here, Dangour's novella preempts our concern with the traumatic potential that breath carries. Anna leaves, not so much because Oscar's breathing but because it triggers in her the recollection of a moment when her brother Martin physically abused her. Or to put it more accurately, she leaves because by this point, Oscar's breathing condition has deteriorated. And as she remembers Martin's assault, she realizes that Oscar, quote, could not help her now. He who had betrayed Anna by falling ill, by allowing this ugly and mysterious illness or sickness to creep into his body like an evil spirit. But Dango delays our discovery of Anna's abuse until the matter of Oscar's breathing has been fully imbricated with their sex life. The illness that Oscar suffers, the eponymous Kafkas Curse, the novel's title, has caused him to reverse, quote, his perfect breathing technique. Breathe in through the nose, breath out through the mouth. Instead, he has adopted a form of mouth breathing that, quote, makes his breathing become irregular and his struggling lungs began to make harsh anguish noises. But this history of breathing mirrors their sexual history. His perfect breathing had a serenity that made him seem to Anna, quote, the most sensitive and refined man she had known. Its subsequent deterioration is described as a perversity that makes him shudder and groan. This mirroring of a language that blurs the line between breath and sex has its narrative correlative because Oscar now breathes so heavily, he causes Anna to lose sleep, which she combats by taking sleeping pills, which give her the dreams that culminate in her recollection of Martin's abuse. Taken on its own, these first 5 or 6 pages provide, I think, a stunning recreation of the difficulties that face both the sufferer of a respiratory illness and their partner when they share a bed, how breath and sex and causal relations often fold into each other in surprising configurations. Perhaps too, it helps us in the COVID moment to think about how the experience of acute respiratory distress can lead to a shared insomnia whose effects can rebound upon even our most apparently secure ideas about ourselves and those closest to us. Who of us has not, lying awake at 3 a.m. and unable to sleep, questioned the very core of what makes us, us? So the two other texts that I go on to talk about in the presentation uploaded are Trionf by Marlene van Niekerk, in which we find a really interesting correlation of human and non-human breathing, in this case particularly the interplay between the family's dog's breathing and the father figure in the novel who's gradually dying of what seems to be a kind of COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And on the other hand, Butterfly Burning by Yvonne Vera, where we find Pepelapi, the protagonist, teaching her lover Fumbata how breathing, and particularly holding your breath, can allow you some sort of agency in your control of the world, but also ultimately becomes the way of Pepelapi releasing her control of the world when she commits suicide. And obviously there's a lot to untangle there or unpick there or whatever. But what I really wanted to do with these texts is to pick up 1 or 2 or 3 moments where I think the post-apartheid, the kind of literature that's emerging in the post-apartheid period is starting to think about breath's ephemerality as simultaneously granting a kind of concrete materiality to people's experience, but also something in a kind of transition, which is to say that it's not about trying to fix yourself to something so much as trying to establish that a relation is happening, which I think actually perhaps chimes a lot with not only what Anna has already said to us today, this kind of attempt, if I understood you correctly, Anna, of trying to think about breath as, sure, allowing for a kind of commonality, but a commonality that is still cognizant of difference, that it still pays tribute to the two-ness, as it were, but also maybe casts ahead to what Giuseppe, I think, will be talking about. If I've heard your, if I've understood your pre-presentation correctly, of a kind of thinking about healing and the way that breath can function as a kind of, not just a sort of a recognition of a wounded body, but also the steps that you need to take in order to heal that body. And I think, in a sense, there's a kind of completedness to the Rainbow Project, with its kind of contemporary discrediting, that gives it a kind of historical completeness, I guess, that allows us to analyze it on its own terms, while also thinking about what it yields to us when thinking about it now. So in some ways, I'm quite interested in how, precisely because there's a kind of connection, a sort of an intuitive connection between the possibility of rainbows as ephemeral kind of gestures of hopefulness or whatever, and the ephemerality of breath being connected. The fact that so much of the early post-apartheid was this, what feels to us now as a kind of naive belief in the possibility of that togetherness through a kind of recognized difference that is about kind of breathing together, I guess. Because there is that resource, and because we don't need to think of that resource so much in the present as still being a viable political project, there is the potential for thinking about why it failed in generous terms rather than in simply condemnatory or kind of dismissive terms. And I think that there's something in the fact that these post-apartheid writers are doing that gives us a kind of resource for thinking about that they use this particular figuration of the breath in this particular way, means that we can, as it were, look to that as a kind of exemplary textual evidence of this kind of thinking taking place. What I would say, just in closing, is many people will immediately leap on the fact that I have used Yvonne Vera as a post-apartheid writer, and will note that Yvonne Vera is a Zimbabwean writer, and ask then why it is that I would put her into the category of post-apartheid writing. And what I would say to that is not that it is not simply to kind of, there's in literary studies, there's a real kind of fetish for what is called distant reading, in which you kind of expand the remit of the geographical remit of what your objects are to the wider world, and you say, well, okay, somebody who writes a text in New Zealand is mentioning apartheid, therefore we can talk about that as post-apartheid literature or whatever. I mean, I'm not discrediting that or dismissing that as a possibility, but what I think is that you can't, without going that far, you can't think about what apartheid was and what apartheid means and what the post-apartheid means without thinking about both South Africa and South Africa's place within the SADC region. And so what I think it is that Vera does is she kind of unsettles for us, including her in this sort of canon, unsettles for us the notion that we need to be thinking of South Africa as exceptional in its attempt to engage with or think about apartheid, in its attempt to engage with and think about the effects of apartheid. And I think that Vera opens us up to this herself when in the Stone Virgins, she starts by thinking about how there's a road that goes from Bulawayo directly to Johannesburg. And it's the road that migrant laborers take to get to Johannesburg, because that is all about opening up the fact that the migrant labor that constitutes the extractive industries that drive the apartheid system do not just come from within South Africa, they also come from the neighboring countries. And so without wanting to kind of move too far away from the kind of breathy potentials, the ephemeral potentials, I think we also need to be thinking about it, obviously when we think about breath and literature, it's easy to move away from the materialities, but in that canon, we also need to be thinking about how that feeds into what it is that is happening in silicosis, with silicosis as it's say depicted in proto-texts such as Peter Abrams' Mind Boy, or indeed how a novel like Trionf is always thinking about the holes that are underneath Johannesburg, the holes that are essentially the mind through places of on which Johannesburg is built. So I hope that that's made some sense, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. So far, you guys have been really good about keeping to time. So Giuseppe, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, PowerPoint share. Okay. Okay. So, can you see this, my screen? Can you? Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for this amazing virtual symposium. As Pamela already told you, my name is Giuseppe Capalbo, and I am a PhD student in literatures in English at the University of Verona. I'm now working on contemporary theatre in English by using both the medical humanities and disability studies as main theoretical frameworks. As you can see, the title of my presentation is I Will Wake Up Choking, Unable to Breath, Breathing and Breathliness in Luis de Salvo's Breathless and Asthma Journal. I don't know whether you are familiar with the topic of my presentation, if some of you have had a chance to look at the pre-recorded video on the conference website. Anyway, in a similar manner to author, I thought to start from the pre-recorded content, while at the same time adding some new stuff. Luis de Salvo was an Italian-American woman who is known for being a Woolf scholar. In particular, in 1989, she published a monograph titled Virginia Woolf, The Impact of Childhood Sexual Abuse on Her Life and Work. By looking at her non-fiction work, de Salvo understood that the memoir was a radical form of history because it so often described pain, sorrow, suffering, humiliation, trauma, and violence. In the specific case of Woolf, the act of writing non-fiction pieces was the key to master the sexual abuse she suffered around 60 years old. At the same time, as she explicitly acknowledged in what is now known as the Puttana essay, working on Woolf gave de Salvo the opportunity to heal herself. And I quote, "Could it be that in concentrating on Woolf's health, I'm also trying to heal myself?" Indeed, when de Salvo started writing memoirs in the 90s, on the one hand, she challenged the gender stereotype that wanted the Italian-American working class woman to be either an angel in the house or a whore. On the other hand, she tried to look back at her past, at her traumatic past. Memoirs such as Vertigo, published in 1996, and Breathless in 1997, reveal how narratives help understanding illness and trauma. As Maria Michaela Coppola has recently pointed out, when illness, and I quote, when illness cracks the subject physical and psychological wholeness, narratives can serve as tools for looking through those fractures, for seeing their preciousness, and ultimately for gaining insight into them. End quote. This is actually the main thesis De Salvo defended in Writing as a Way of Healing, a theoretical treatise published in 1999. Whereas Coppola, Maria Michaela Coppola, drew on the Japanese art of kintsugi, De Salvo sees writing as a fixer, and I quote, as in photography, writing acts for me as a kind of fixer, like the chemical, the fixer you use to stabilize the image. In other words, the act of writing allows the subject to clearly define and embrace traumatic events, which were probably removed from their conscious memory. And that's more, since narrative medicine scholar Rita Sharon states that writing has become essential not only in treating trauma survivors, but in ordinary general medicine. But let's go step by step. In Vertigo, Luis de Salvo focuses on the recovery of the Italian heritage in order to negotiate between two cultures. In fact, as a third-generation Italian-American daughter, she grew up in a family which tried to hide the Italian roots, the more to fit in the American society. Besides, on the one hand, she looks at issues such as family bonds. For instance, when her father came back from the war front with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, she experienced what Roger Lakehurst defined secondary victimhood, because she herself, De Salvo herself, felt shell-shocked. On the other hand, just as Woolf, she recognizes being an incest survivor. But what interests me today is the very end of Vertigo, where De Salvo remembers the moment in which, after her mother's death, she discovered a mysterious disease no one was able to immediately diagnose: asthma. One day, a doctor suggested that her asthma was somehow linked to a blocked grief, and I quote, "I think that I haven't yet begun to grieve because I haven't wanted to give up my mother. If my grief stays bottled up inside me, then my mother stays inside me. Can it be that the constriction of my asthma, in part, is an inability to mourn?" As you can see, De Salvo links the development of asthma to those traumatic events she was not able to overcome. In so doing, we could read asthma as a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. If we were to apply Lakehurst's partition of symptoms, we could say that asthma came as a consequence of the second cluster of symptoms related to PTSD, that is the persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma the victim experienced. After Vertigo, De Salvo published Breathless, which entirely focuses on a newly discovered disease. The subtitle signals in advance the book content, the experience of asthma, and the genre status. This book differs from the previous one, from Vertigo, being an autobiographical account of illness. Again, according to Rita Sharon, this kind of writing could be defined pathography, as it is an autobiography which only deals with one's illness. Conversely, in Writing as a Way of Healing, De Salvo defined this genre wounded body narrative, and I quote, Nancy Meyers calls memoirs about illness the literature of personal disaster. Anatole Broyard called them the literature of illness and the literature of death. I call them wounded body narratives, though I recognize that there cannot be a wounded body in need of healing without a wounded psyche or spirit that is also in need of healing. At the very beginning, De Salvo states, I try to ignore this body I inhabit that has declared war on me. By doing so, De Salvo describes illness by using what Susan Sontag defined the military metaphor. In fact, the body is conceived as a colonial land under siege. What does this tell us? According to Phil Barker, and I quote, this use of metaphor serves as a linguistic anchor for our confused attempts to understand a potentially ineffable phenomenon. In other words, when one is not ready to face illness as it is, she turns to metaphors, which in the majority of cases aim at negatively describe illness as pollution or invasion of the body. I have also seen that author deals with this kind of metaphors. For example, I mean, there is this. For example, there is a similarity when illness is compared to to an evil spirit. So that's an interesting point that we can discuss later. Initially, De Salvo wonders whether the use of metaphor for the breathing disorder she developed is just a personal way of facing illness or a shared tendency. For this reason, she states, now that I am sick, I want to learn about how other writers faced illness. Besides Woolf, she focuses on Susan Sontag, the volcano lover. Here she finds several references to asthma, which in a way carry a metaphoric flavor. For example, when describing the character of Catherine, Sontag highlights how the coal-infested air of London was the reason why Catherine developed asthma. Please, I ask you to pay attention to the expression coal-infest. Infest is another of those negative words which hints at the spread of swarm in a troublesome manner. In fact, one of the examples the Oxford English Dictionary include for the verb to infest is the house is infested with cockroaches. Then she takes into consideration Pat Barker Regeneration Trilogy. In the third volume, The Ghost Road, published in 1995, when referring to a person with asthma, we read, the curious thing is, as soon as I saw his face, my own chest tightened. Here again, focus on tightened. The chest is metaphorically rendered as if it could become tighter when looking at an asthmatic person, when you are in front of an asthmatic person. This inability to explicitly talk about illness reminds us of what Virginia Woolf detailed regarding language in On Being Ill, an essay published in 1930. And I quote, there is something ready-made for him. There is nothing ready-made for him. He is forced to coin words himself, and taking his pain in one hand and a lump of pure sound in the other, so to crush them together that a brand new word in the end drops out. Woolf understood what was to follow. In other words, once you recognize the poverty of the language when it comes to illness, when it comes to talk about illness, you can either use metaphors or remount language itself in order to properly describe, properly locate illness. Later in time, Sontag would work on Woolf's insight. Since in illness as metaphor, she states, my point is that illness is not a metaphor, and that the most truthful way of regarding illness is one most purified of, most resistant to metaphoric thinking. I argue that Luis de Salvo, after she went through a first metaphoric stage, was able to describe asthma as it was, without metaphors. Take as an example this quotation, and I quote, I started having asthma attacks. They came in the middle of the night, and I would wake up choking, unable to breathe. Still the most terrifying sensation I have ever had. Although, as Angela Woods pointed out, medical humanities has tended to look at narrative accounts of patients' experience in presenting alternative accounts of illness, this is an example of how one can describe non-narrative aspects of asthma, specifically by drawing on one of our upcoming keynote speakers, Jane McNaughton. I see De Salvo as an aware breather, a person who is aware of their breath because it is pathological. And in fact, in writing as a way of healing, she states, though I am outspoken, in the earliest drafts of my memoir, Breathless, I didn't mention the word mucus in my account of what an asthma attack feels like. Though managing a mucus is so productive that it can stop my breath and kill me is the most salient feature of my life with asthma. In so doing, I see a wounded body narrative turning into a healing narrative. If the wounded body narrative aims at producing an account of illness free of metaphors, we then need to see whether it turns into a recovery narrative or a healing narrative. The recovery narrative usually provides a happy ending, as if illness was completely absorbed so that you can come back to the kingdom of the well, as Sontag will say. The healing narrative instead does not deny illness, does not see the ill person as a hero who was able to to fight against the monster, but instead the healing narrative highlights the process of healing rather than a full recovery. Today, the issue of breathing and breathlessness is one of paramount importance, as breathlessness is a common symptom of COVID-19. In this light, I would like to show you some excerpts from The Guardian, on which I'm currently working. Associate Professor of English Language and Culture Anna Poletti stated that she felt as if the lungs were burning and that this feeling at the space of a horseshoe as it ran down the outside and along the bottom of her lungs. And again, Simon Atkinson states, my breathing is deteriorating. In bed at night, I sound like a cattle farm. This is the title, this title says, Fighting for Breath. In each and every example, it seems to me that we face a first stage of metaphoric thinking. Think about the word horseshoe, cattle farm, fighting. Taking the cue from De Salvo, I would like to close my presentation with two open questions, which could probably fuel a discussion in the question and answer session. How has the COVID-19 pandemic fostered the discussion on breathing and breathlessness? Specifically, is there any rendering of breathing and breathlessness in the time of COVID-19 pandemic purified of metaphoric thinking? Have you read anything in which in a way could be seen as a wounded body narrative with a healing effect? These are my references and I thank you for your attention.
All right, I'd like to thank our three panelists for these wonderful, rich papers. We have about a half an hour, and I wanted to just sort of point out some of the things I picked up on as I was listening to the presentations. just to open up the conversation then. So the three, they really sort of, for me, they were very nice because they overlapped and brought out different aspects of what it means to think about breath. And just some quick ideas that came to me while I was listening to all three of you. Breath as a point of liberation versus breath as politics. Thinking about co-breathing, I think Anna had brought that up really nicely in the idea of the relationality of the individual and the collective. Also ideas around rhythms and sharing. Arthur had brought up the idea of the ephemerality of breath and the material versus the metaphoric, which I think extended into Giuseppe's paper as well. And I'll just lastly then also as well, Giuseppe's paper brought in ideas of breathlessness, which I think is really important to bring into the conversation on breath itself, and choking and asthma, and thinking about breathlessness as a form of mourning as opposed to just breath as mourning, which I thought was really fascinating. And I felt like through all the papers, the specter of George Floyd is also there. So I'm gonna both open up for questions to everyone, but also maybe leave that for all three of you to think through where George Floyd would fit into some of your narratives, just to throw that out there. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. Thank you again for your papers, all three of you. Do I have any questions? I'm trying to see. Or if any of the panelists would like to ask a question of another panelist, that's also a possibility. Does anyone want to take on my George Floyd specter?
Yeah, I have a question for both Arthur and Giuseppe. I don't know if.
Yeah, please go ahead, Anna.
So listening to your talk, Arthur, it made me question my own talk, because sometimes, you know, you talked about naivete and how thinking about sharing breath can be, you know, naive. Because you gave examples, I don't know if I am reading them correctly, where sharing breath seems impossible, right? Where the differences, where the difference becomes such in the recognition of the difference of illness and the difference of abuse becomes such that the sharing of breath is impossible. So I found yeah, that maybe the consideration of sharing breath needs to include the possibility that in recognizing the differences of breath, there might be points where sharing breath is impossible. So I don't know if you have anything to say about, more to say about that.
Well, thank you, Anna. I have to say that, like, what I found really exciting about your presentation was precisely in its careful and considered building up of a framework in which that possibility can happen, right? That it's not just that we kind of go, oh well, we breathe together and we're all fine, right? That there are processes that you go through. There's a learning process to doing that you go through which comes from recognizing differences and you know, with that recognition of differences, fundamental inequalities. I guess the reason why, and I probably should have framed it better, the reason why it feels like it's impossible in post-apartheid, the early post-apartheid, is because obviously in the early post-apartheid we're dealing with the political fallout, and not just the political, the economic, the social fallout of you know, like almost 50 years of a particularly insidious institutionalized racism that itself came, as historians increasingly are aware of, came on the back of, you know, centuries of equally pernicious, if less explicitly recognized, forms of racism, that in which we do see a kind of iteration of moments, right? Like the 1913 moment to the 1948 moment to the 1994 moment, which was supposed to solve all those problems. And so in a sense, what I like about the way that our two papers maybe talk to each other is precisely that they're working towards each other from the opposite directions, right? The possibility that breath is fine needs to be complicated, and these are the steps by which you make it more attuned to the kind of difference that where I start from, where the kind of notion of an interrelational, a healthy kind of interrelation seems impossible, is at least potentially realized or potentially kind of accessed. And I guess that that's where the ambiguities of what's happening in the post-apartheid literature moment is particularly useful, because at least given how inconceivable it is that people will get over these types of divisions, once one, you know, drills down even below the merest surface of what the Rainbow Nation ideology was supposed to do for us, one gets to, you know, the possibility that well, if we don't try so hard to think about this as going to, it's all going to heal at once, and that healing attempts will,
the story, the history, the literary history of illness is always around, goes always around this metaphor. So it could be interesting to see whether we are able as human beings to walk on new metaphors. So thank you. And I don't know whether these actually answer to your question, but
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
All right, I believe we have a question from Carla now.
Hi, thank you very much for those very fascinating presentations. I have a question that kind of also links to some of the themes that have been coming up in the week so far. And I suppose what the three presentations did for me was to bring to mind the idea of shared versus forced, and voluntary versus involuntary breathing or lack of breathing. So the ways in which we become more conscious of our breath through studied practice like pranayama, but that there may be health-related illnesses, health-related responses that facilitate asthma either through traumatic inhibitions in the body or through external factors. And also the idea of the breath not being shared when it's forced upon you. So somebody's breath when there's a moment of violence against people, the breath has a very different space. And it kind of links in some ways, I mean, Pamela, your original question about George Floyd and We Can't Breathe, Firdousa's workshop last week directly linked the ideas of the racism, structural inequalities, pranayama, and breathing, not breathing. And I suppose the thing that strikes me in this space is that if we extend those ideas of shared and forced and voluntary and involuntary breath, breathing, and access to breathing, we can take these conversations carry on taking them into these very interesting discussions. So one of the things that came out of the presentation around children with autism who do boxing lessons is that children sometimes literally forget to breathe. So they have to be told to breathe. And it struck me that we're living through this time of being incredibly conscious of breath and breathing and how other people's breath and breathing are near us. But of course, the ability to breathe freely has always been mediated by social inequalities. And what COVID has done, I think somewhere, Giuseppe, to engage with your question, is that it's taken stuff that's always been there and somehow brought it to a different kind of form. It's shone a spotlight in a slightly different way, but none of the stuff is essentially new. I suppose the thing that strikes me though across all these things is that in many ways, a lot of what this is about is the fallout of the Capitalocene. The cold infused, was it cold? Sorry, I've forgotten the Sontag quote, but that equivalent is that this is the Capitalocene infected air that we are all breathing. It is, you know, the children who are growing up with asthma because they live near mine dumps in Joburg. It's the restrictions of respiration because the kind of traumas of apartheid have not been dealt with. It's GBV, it's those series of things in addition to this particular moment of planetary crisis. and the way in which individuals and communities are experiencing the pandemic, the capitalist scene, the planetary crisis, and the other kind of spaces of making sense of things, metaphorically or not metaphorically. So I suppose I don't really have a question so much that was a comment, but I suppose what I am interested in is the ideas of the overlaps between forced, voluntary, involuntary breath, breathing, and access to breath or breathing, or not being able to breathe, or breathlessness. Thank you.
And the ideas of conscious and unconscious breathing, that perhaps before this pandemic, many of us were breathing unconsciously, right? And as Giuseppe said, only when the breathing becomes pathological, we become conscious of it. So perhaps we need to start constructing a notion of conscious breathers that are conscious of the breathing, even if it's not pathological.
And this could be one of the other things we could discuss if we are all together during the keynote speech. This is one of the main issues discussed by McNaughton about this notion of aware breather. So it could be an idea to discuss this theme together in that occasion. I mean, during the discussion.
Right, I believe we had Nawazi next.
Hi, everyone. I have a question for Arthur. And it's simply about the process that you went through in actually selecting the books that you talk about. Why those 3 books? What is it about breath in those 3 books that makes them quite pertinent to the talk that you gave? And why not others? Because I'm sure that a lot of writers must write, at least refer to breath and breathing in the course of saying he breathed out or he sighed or so forth.
Totally. Thank you for the question, Ulwazi. There are obviously 2 answers to your question. There's like the professional answer, and then there's the true answer. The true answer is simply that those texts were the ones that presented themselves to me, and not others. But in a sense, those were the texts that I went to because they have been very influential in the way in which post-apartheid literary scholarship has tried to articulate what the post-apartheid literary moment is. And what's interesting is that although people have written really interestingly, obviously, about how the post-apartheid literary scene is understood, using those texts, nobody's really talked that much about the breathing scenes, which are not, I mean, elsewhere I've kind of talked about how the problem when you try to talk about breath in literature is always going to be that it's everywhere, right? Like, it's, so as soon as you know, making a kind of interpretive claim about one text over another is always going to kind of get you into trouble, because, you know, what is a meaningful use of breath? And ultimately, any time that a literary text says, it mentions breath in any kind of way, it is marked, because no text needs to mention the breath, because it's just taken for granted. So then, but I guess what is particularly interesting is that there's such protracted passages in these 3 texts that are relate to how you think about your breath, how you control your breath, how you work with your breath, and how your breath's relation to others is often determined by conditions that are directly pertinent to what other people are talking about when they talk about the post-apartheid moment. So that was really it, in a sense, is that those I mean, and I'd sort of end with a kind of sort of an expression of openness that if you can think of texts that are engaging with the breath from that moment that I just haven't mentioned, that I'd love to hear what those are. So it's not because I maintain a kind of preference for, I mean, I'm acutely aware that in the text that I have, there's not a Black South African author. You know, that is a lacuna in that, and that's something I recognize. And it's just because I couldn't find something. So I guess, I mean, without asking you to do my homework for me, yeah, if you know of something, then it'd be great to hear. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay. We have a question from Steve Reed next. And then I'm going to put myself in the lineup after Steve, if everyone doesn't mind.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank you for the fascinating presentations. I wanted to respond to Anna's question about the shifting the metaphor and whether thinking about it differently is helpful. And I definitely think that is a strategy that works. You know, a lot of healthcare is the prevalent metaphors about sort of fixing a machine. Something goes wrong, you take it to the garage and you get it sorted out, and then you carry on, you know. Or and then this, as you mentioned, the duality of fighting a disease as if we are in a war. But our colleagues in the rehabilitation professions like occupational therapy and physiotherapy, etc., and other colleagues in palliative care, terminal care, don't use that metaphor at all. They never talk about fighting. They talk about adapting, and to the extent that they propose a definition of health is about the ability to adapt. One's health is measured by one's adaptability, positive adaptability, and that is an intriguing, as opposed to the sort of standard, you know, World Health Organization definition that it's more than the absence of disease, etc., etc. But this idea of adaptability for me as a metaphor, and then reapplying it, bringing it back into the situation to say, how does this help us rethink our response, for example, to COVID? Rather than a war, how do we adapt in the most positive way? It definitely makes a difference to our behaviors and our whole response and the way that we treat one another. So my answer is yes.
Did anyone want to respond to Steve's comments? No? Yes? Anna?
I agree. I mean, a metaphor, you know, I mean, what I try to do in my project is this consideration that breathing and that being is not just the machine, you know, that when we breathe, there is a meaning to it, and meaning has an impact in the physiology. And so the way we are being bombarded with metaphors and ways of speaking of our illness is in some way manifesting in certain symptoms, in certain, or in the ways in which we relate to those symptoms that are not necessarily allowing us to heal. So yes, I thank Steve for telling us more about this.
Carla, did you have another question? I'm not sure if your hand was up from prior or...
No, actually just a follow on from Steve,
yeah.
Because I think, you know, these other central issues, of course, that metaphor is often gendered, so, and linked to the kind of histories of the disciplines in which they are most randomly employed, especially in relation to health. So the notion of the body as machine, the notion of the fight, this constant fight, are quite masculinist, militarist metaphors, you know, that we saw most commonly with the AIDS epidemic, and that link to this very specific notions of an idea of something that can be conquered and or built or rebuilt. So written very much into that modernist, and as I think some of what you were talking about alternative knowledge systems, or, you know, knowledge systems that don't necessarily follow that kind of trajectory of a kind of victory as the ultimate goal of the narrative or of the metaphor or of the experience. And so I think, yeah, just to kind of support what Steve's saying, that those things, and those are often fairly gendered because of the way in which ideas of success or health have been measured. And so it's just that kind of thought came to my mind. Thanks.
I'll just start my question. Steve, did you want to respond to that?
No, can I just clarify this thing? Because I find the idea that illness is not metaphorical. Maybe you are meaning the illness experience is not metaphorical, but the way that we think about illness, as it were, from outside, it can be used metaphorically. So that's just a clarification, because I found that intriguing. We all know when we are ill, you're not thinking metaphorically, you're just blooming ill. So, but are you talking about the illness experience rather than the...
Does someone want to respond to that? Arthur, Anna?
For example, when I think about the experience of illness, I mean, the way in which, as you said, the way in which we think about illness, the way in which we try to write about illness is metaphorical in a way. But actually, you are right. When we think, when we are ill, actually, we know, we are aware of what we have or what we are going to do with our illness. It's the moment in which you try to put down what you are feeling that becomes, in a way, in my opinion, metaphorical, more metaphorical than in the real life. When you are, for example, in front of a doctor, the doctor says in a way, what's wrong. So there is no metaphor in a way. But when you try to write down what you are feeling after that diagnosis, in that moment, in a way, metaphor happens.
Thank you.
I'll just come in quickly here, because my question, I think, maybe also confuses or clarifies when we're talking about metaphors versus the materiality or the embodied. I was just struck by the sort of disciplinarity of each of the panelists. So, you know, we're thinking through the philosophical by bringing in sort of, you know, we could say Western, non-Western, Irigaray, and you know, Sanskrit. And then we can then think through Arthur's paper as being the literary and bringing in 3 literary scholars. And then with Giuseppe, we can think about bringing in a scholar, right? A scholar of Virginia Woolf, and bringing in Susan Sontag, so bringing scholars or expertise. So I'm wondering then how the source materials themselves tie into the ways in which we think about metaphor or materiality in relation to breath. And then just one last point for Arthur. I thought it was really important, that point you made about bringing in Yvonne Vera in as a sort of post-apartheid, even though she's not located in South Africa. And I think that's a really important point, something that I've actually tried to argue for as well, is that you need to think about South Africa within Southern Africa, and the way in which that opens up. So for someone in Zimbabwe, that post-apartheid is very much real as it's apartheid from outside of South Africa. So I just wanted to bring up that point as well. So I don't know if there was a question in there, but one may perhaps more of a comment, but just to think about the disciplines in relation to how we use metaphors or and materialities or embodiments of breath and breathlessness. Any other questions, comments?
Could you, if you've got that, if you've published it, could you send me a copy of that work?
Yeah.
To read it.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Happy to.
It did strike me that there was something interesting about, as you say, the objects that we all look at. Because obviously in literary studies at the moment, there's a big hoo-ha, I guess. Nice breathy term, about what the object is and what it is that literary scholarship is supposed to do. You know, in a sense, to riff on what Carla was saying, English literature sometimes feels like the most capitalist of subjects, in the sense that it runs from crisis to crisis to crisis, exploiting that productively to try and keep itself going when it's probably running out of steam. What I think is interesting when you come to a literary text is you know, one can talk about how literary texts are great kind of works that inspire us to think differently about the world and, you know, open up our eyes to whatever difference, etc., etc., etc. But they're also commodities that